everyone, welcome. So for today's webinar, I'd like to think of what we're about to do as less of a sort of regular webinar and more of an experiential trend report. So as Jeremy said, we've kind of put together these top 100 and then boiled down to top 20 trends of 2021, put it together in this awesome report, and today I'm more or less walking you through it. So just as a general sort of high level itinerary, I'll start by introducing you to the general topic. Jeremy did explain a bit about how we've actually curated this list of this top 20, but I'll add some color to that as well. And then of course, I'll actually walk you through that set of 20 insight articles. Following that, I'm actually going to bring Jeremy back for what we call a virtual trend safari. Essentially, he and I will have a fireside chat to just talk about what the recharting or the future, this new normal will look like in 2021, given a huge part of what we do here at Trend Hunter is actually help our brand partners create the future. This is top of mind information for Jeremy. After we do that fireside chat, I'll open up for questions from you all. So be sure to jot those questions down and we'll get to them right before we wrap up today. All right, so before we get into it, I want to talk a bit about Trend Hunter's methodology. As Jeremy said, we have a huge network of global trend hunters, about 240,000 people across the world who just love trends. And essentially what they do is when they find a trend, they submit it to our idea database, which to date has about 3 billion views. Now, the active people actually looking at trends on the database and clicking through them and interacting with them helps us crowd filter out which of those trends represents a unique opportunity for any industry. Once we find one of those opportunities, then it filters through our system of AI and our human advisors, our research team. I hope they're on the webinar today. Hi, everyone. To help us identify custom opportunities, custom insights, custom reports, and often custom webinars, which we do privately for our clients. So it's a very self-sufficient system. It's the reason why at Trend Hunter, we're able to turn around custom research very quickly, and we're able to offer it at a much affordable price. Now let's get to the content. Obviously for today, the majority of what we'll be talking about is that content. So I want to clarify one of the most important pieces of our whole system and how the content works, which is the scoring system. So every article on Trend Hunter receives a score out of 10. The sample score here is 8.8, which is above average. And we find that score by leveraging 3 key factors of popularity, freshness, and activity. So popularity is fairly self-explanatory. It's literally the amount of views that an article receives. Activity is all about engagement. Are people clicking on it? Are they looking at all the photos? Are they leaving comments? Are they posting it to their social media pages? Freshness is all about the relative newness of an article. And on top of that, we also highlight demographics. So as you can see in the top right-hand corner of your screen here, we have these icons that identify the age of the target demographic of the article, the gender, as well as the general location. Now, at Trend Hunter, our reports tend to consist of about 3 different kinds of content. For today, we'll just be looking at the one, which is the insights. And as Jeremy said, I'm the Chief Insights Officer at Trend Hunter. These are my babies. Our consumer insights are these kind of high-level overarching patterns that often span different industries and scope. So I want to walk you through the different components of an insight so that you know what you're looking at when we get to that section of today's report walkthrough. So first off, and perhaps most importantly, you have the trend, the actual trend itself. What is the trend that we've identified? We talk about what that opportunity is. And then the next section there is the actual insight itself. So that explores the target consumer's motivations, attitudes, beliefs, and ultimately the tension that has kind of created this opportunity, because opportunity tends to come out, of course, of a sort of push and pull. And then we have the demographics and scoring, as I referenced in the last slide, as well as identifying the patterns and the megatrends associated with the piece. So we won't talk too deeply about patterns and megatrends today, but essentially both function as a kind of tool to help you understand what the next steps could be after viewing this insight. Now, to that idea of giving you those next steps and applicability of the insight to your role, finally, we have the workshop question. So each insight is paired with a workshop question, which is intended to help provoke thought and guide a brainstorm, either individually or with your team, about the relevancy or actionability of the insight. So for today, I will actually be reading out the workshop questions of each of the insights I walk through. Given the size of the group, which I love, we won't actually be demoing those questions with one another. So my suggestion is to jot down your thoughts when we get to one of these workshop questions. All right, so now we get into the actual trend itself. Now, of course, 2020 was no regular year. And in order to select that sort of top 20 of 2021, we had to filter everything through a system. And that system is the chaos-induced recharting framework that we recently developed here at Trend Hunter. So as you can see, it can be applied to everything that's happened over this past year, which, as I said, was no regular year. So a little bit more on that crisis, chaos, and recharting, which is essentially a sort of chronological timeline for the way disruption happens in the midst of crisis and chaos. So first off, you have your path dependency phase, which in the previous map was between 2010 to 2019. Essentially, during these times, people make decisions based on normalcy. We're in this era of sort of predictability, and people are making decisions, whether those decisions are about what brands they want to buy from or what they do in their roles and their jobs, based on patterns that they've actually seen before, based on things that they've done in the past. Now, from our standpoint as a research firm, it's quite easy to sort of predict what ends up happening during this time. Definitely interesting. Definitely, we can get thrown for a loop, but comparatively to crisis phase, for example, path dependency is definitely easier. Now, as for crisis, I hate to drop the U word, but crisis is sort of characterized by whether or not we are in an unprecedented situation, which definitely happened this year. So as you can see on the previous map, this was mapped out to the first couple of months of quarantine. And during times such as these, people make decisions based on what will grant them a sense of safety, emotionally and physically, this general idea of security. So if you think, for example, of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, then it's about that bottom tier, what provides you with a sense of safety. Then we get into chaos. And many would say that we are currently in that chaos phase. Pardon me. During chaos, typically we see people trying to sort of consolidate what they used to do and had become used to during path dependency and the current circumstances and what they dictate. So it's this time where they're kind of testing different behaviors and trying to find a compromise between the old and the new. However, moving forward from that, and what we're talking about today is the recharting. In the recharting, the behaviors that we observe during crisis and chaos kind of solidify into this new normal, which is a term I'm sure we've all heard many, many times over the past few months. And the recharting, as you saw in the previous timing map, is what we're predicting for 2021. Now, there are some key overarching themes that you'll see within this report and that we predict for the recharting. So I want to very quickly explain those before we get into the trends that will further illustrate them. So first off, we have a pattern that we're calling in the now. In the now is all about the idea of age being entirely redefined and the definitions of different generational behaviors being reset. If you did attend Future Festival this year, and if you did, please say so in the chat. I want to say a quick second hello. Then you may have heard me talk a bit about microgenerational behavior. I touched quite a bit on these themes in that presentation, but one thing that's really sticking out is the way Generation Z specifically is reimagining adulthood. Now, unfortunately for this generation, they are just on the brink of adulthood. Many of them are in their early 20s. They're thinking about what their future looks like during a time where the opportunities that are typically granted to people on that traditional trajectory of adult success may not be available to them. So they're kind of reimagining what exactly that could look like. Now, although I'm focusing on Gen Z here, this is something that's happening across different generations. The general idea within the now is that all generations are kind of rethinking what it means to be at this stage in their respective lives. All right, so next we have living fully. Living fully is one of my favorites. Here we basically see people sort of leaning into these simple methods of experiencing joy. We see a focus on ways to feel fulfilled on a day-to-day basis that are often about reveling in simplicity. So if you're familiar, for example, with the cottagecore movement, the idea that people are looking to move out of cities and move into these sort of countryside areas, that's a part of living fully. If you, like me, are one of the people who was a cliche during quarantine and baked a loaf of bread or three, then you've participated in living fully. So it's this idea of leaning on these sort of hobbies that make you feel more fulfilled and more connected. Speaking of connected, the third pattern that we're seeing in the recharting is this idea of community first. Community first acknowledges the fact that although this year was themed by the pandemic, it was also themed by political reckoning. And this created a sense of community that is furthered by the fact that social distancing rules created literal distance between loved ones. And so in 2021, we'll see this theme of true connection further emphasized. Now, to that point, that will also impact other areas, social good areas that are about creating the kind of environment that's conducive to connecting with people and general happiness. So we're seeing people rally around small businesses, supporting their local economies. We're seeing more attention paid to the environment, etc. And then last, but definitely not least, is the role technology will play in the recharting. Technology will essentially be the key to society being able to heal from everything that's happened in 2020, because technology will, of course, enable the safety. We'll be able to reduce face-to-face time and, of course, the risk of spreading the virus because of technology and the connectivity that it allows. But also technology will be key in helping us not just replace the experiences we used to have in path dependency, but even enhance them, so that the world that we move into in 2021 is even better than the world we had in 2019 and before that. All right, so now that we've covered these themes of the recharting, and if you want to take a photo of this slide, I highly recommend it. Let's get into those 20 trends. Okay, so first off, we have Gen Z Creative. So Gen Z Creative speaks directly to that in the now theme that I talked about, which is all about redefining age. So what we're seeing with Gen Z Creative is this idea that this generation has kind of realized that that traditional sort of upwardly mobile approach to becoming adult may not necessarily be for them, given everything that's happening. And further to that point, the way that they've already been viewing their interactivity with the world. This is a social media generation. They believe in self-expression. They believe in creativity. They also know that there are many alternatives to traditional post-secondary education. And so what we're seeing is a generation that's leaning more toward building up these various skills and honing their hobbies and interacting with these sort of less conventional approaches to building up new skills and creating a career for themselves that's more conducive to personal fulfillment and creativity than it is to this sort of tiered approach to what success can look like for a person. So a couple of different examples here. We see a lot of e-learning, of course, but specifically we're seeing e-learning that's focused on helping this generation build up more creative skills. So for example, photography mentorship programs or youth-focused creative agencies, aptly named Adolescent, that are all about helping Gen Z consumers become these sort of digital creators and foster these brand relationships. So as I said, I'll be showing these workshop questions for each of these insights, but we won't necessarily be answering them. So jot down your answers here. How could your brand appeal to Gen Z's sense of creativity and personal expression? All right, so up next, we get to modern beekeeping. Now, modern beekeeping may seem hyper-specific. It's essentially about innovations in the beekeeping space to help preserve and sustain colonies. But it actually ties to that idea of living fully, as well as that concept of peer-to-peer. At this point, I think it's fairly common knowledge that the health of bees is conducive to the health of the environment. And what we're seeing is, especially during quarantine, a lot of consumers are becoming interested in being beekeepers themselves. Further to that point, we're seeing services that are developed not just to help individuals get into this hobby and help make the environment healthier, but we're also seeing companies that are already in this space integrate some of those principles as well to take a more kind of human approach to saving the environment and specifically saving the bees. So the question here, how is your brand prioritizing environmental protection and conservation? Leave that up for you to jot down some thoughts. Okay, now we get to one that really excites me personally. I love the fashion industry. I've loved the opportunity to kind of see up close how it's adjusted over the past few months. And here we have Model Free Runway, a really great example of that. So what we're seeing is the debuting of fashion collections adapted by limiting the use of models. So as a replacement to having models walk down the runway, we see a variation of many different approaches to this. So for example, virtual avatars. The Sims inviting fashion expression with streetwear options is a really great example. But my favorite example is Jeremy Scott putting on a puppet show runway for Moschino. So really creative, the use of marionettes. And, you know, with the Jeremy Scott example, it almost seems like the opposite of that idea of the role of tech, because marionettes are this kind of analog approach to showcasing clothing. But of course, the ability to actually see any of these shows, no matter what the replacement for the models was, is only enabled by technology. So here we see a really great example of that theme of the role of tech that isn't necessarily obviously technology upfront. So the question here, how will your brand continue to adapt to changed consumer habits amidst the ongoing pandemic? Okay, now up next we have esports nutrition. Now, esports nutrition is all about the idea that in the midst of quarantine, we see more and more people engaging in gaming. I myself picked up a Nintendo Switch, which I never thought I would do in 2020, but I love it. I'm not saying, you know, I'm by no means at the level of someone who plays esports competitively. But what's interesting is the fact that people have been doing this more and more during quarantine is making it so that the sort of view of esports players as athletes is becoming increased. And so we're seeing food products that are specifically targeted toward these communities. Now, this is really interesting because it serves a few of our different themes here. First off, there's the obvious, which is the role of technology, that idea that technology can be this catalyst for new kinds of experiences. But there's also the idea of community first. Esports are essentially a community-driven platform. So this idea of being able to play games with one another and meet new people in these sort of global settings and keep track of these individuals who are gaming, both speaks to that idea of technology, but also that idea of keeping people connected. How might your brand target the esports consumer, specifically through health and wellness? All right, now up next, we get to dark stores. Now, I'm sure many of you are wondering what will happen to the retail industry moving forward. In the recharting, you know, what will we see from that? Now, there are many different directions that we believe the retail industry will go in, but perhaps one of the most interesting is dark stores. So dark stores are essentially miniature warehouse adjacent spaces whose sole purpose is to pack online orders for pickup or delivery. Now, dark stores, interestingly enough, are not new. If you are from the retail industry, then you know that these have been around for a while purely out of necessity. However, they're becoming much more important in the midst of quarantine, and we believe will persist as an important piece of the retail puzzle moving forward, because of course, they are a way to continue to enable that sort of e-commerce approach to retail in a way that's much more efficient. Now, the idea of efficiency in the retail industry, and of course, the technology that'll enable that, will become more and more important as we continue on into the recharting. So here we see this sort of emphasis on, yes, efficiency, but also that idea of seamlessness and how dark stores are kind of enabling that. So how might your brand create a seamless experience in the e-commerce sector? All right, now up next, we have smart testing. Now, smart testing is an insight that is interesting because the examples that you see here are actually mostly born out of the idea of people needing to get rapid tests before traveling. So what's interesting about this insight in those examples, however, is that the technology we're seeing at airports is something that we're now seeing outside of that space where testing is a necessity, and instead where testing would be good to do at a given point. So the general idea here is that we're seeing tech brands updating these procedures to enable the kind of efficiency and urgency you'd see at a place like an airport or a hospital in day-to-day spaces. Now, this will speak to what we see in the recharting, because moving forward, regardless of what ends up happening, the idea of continuing to keep track of the pandemic moving forward will be important. And so this sort of accessible and rapid fire testing in these spaces that people are likely to cross on a day-to-day basis will be extremely important. So how might your brand utilize technology to ensure consumer safety during and after the pandemic? Now up next, we have skin hunger. Now skin hunger sounds kind of strange, but it's by far one of my favorite insights. It speaks to this idea that is actually unique to this year, when we're seeing people miss that general feeling of human contact. Now, this can be actual physical touch. It can be the simple act of shaking someone's hand. And interestingly enough, we're seeing art, we're seeing clothing, we're seeing various sort of products dedicated to mimicking that idea of being in contact with another person from a physical standpoint. So for example, we have these sort of deep touch mimicking weighted blankets, backpacking off of that weighted blanket craze we saw in 2019. Hug simulating vests, which looks super, super cozy, I have to say. Now, of course, this touches on that idea of community first. And we're actually seeing some applications of products such as these into technologies where you're able to both speak to people and be able to sort of simulate that idea of actually shaking their hand, of touching them, of hugging them. Your brand create a more comforting environment for consumers through your product or service experience. All right, now we get to Milkman models. So Milkman model is an insight that looks at the idea of circular delivery systems. So this sort of Milkman model that is one part direct to consumer and one part focusing in on reducing waste. So as you can guess, this ties to that idea of peer-to-peer. Now, peer-to-peer, of course, is this concept of being able to ensure that the environment that we're living in or the economy that we are encouraging is something that's conducive to everyone being able to retain happiness. And Milkman model, of course, speaks to that. So how might your brand alleviate environmental concerns for consumers by assuming a responsibility? By which we mean, instead of having consumers make the choice of which of the brands they'll interact with that have the most sustainable practices, how will you simply have sustainable practices to enable the fact that no matter what choice they make, they're doing something that's good for the environment? Okay, so up next we have Millennial Move. Now, Millennial Move, as a millennial myself, this is an insight that, on one hand, I find very fascinating because I am a researcher. This is my living, how I sort of spend all my days. But as a millennial, I find it a little bit sad because essentially what Millennial Move is all about is the idea that the future that the millennial has been working toward, this idea of living in this metropolitan city and having this sort of cool job and this sort of future that's both exciting and fulfilling and conducive to the traditional definition of success, is not really what we're seeing anymore. Now, in some ways, this can be very exciting, as we're seeing places like Barbados offer one-year visas for remote workers. But on the other hand, we see a lot more millennials sort of coming to terms with the fact that perhaps their adulthood will be more normal than what they were originally shooting for. So this, of course, kind of ties into that idea of in the now, which, as I said earlier, originally we talked about through the lens of Gen Z redefining adulthood, but it applies to every generation, and we see that here. How is your brand accommodating the urgent emerging needs of different demographics amidst the ongoing pandemic? So next up, we have home professional. Now, home professional is essentially the idea that many of us are working from home. And so in order to accommodate that, the idea of having to dial in but still look professional, we're seeing fashion brands releasing clothing that is both comfortable and fairly professional looking. I hope that this is something I'm currently pulling off. You can't see it, but I'm wearing leather jogging pants which I think are still fairly professional. And this is sort of what we're seeing, this sort of compromise and most importantly, redefinition of what it means to conduct yourself properly in the workplace. How might your brand increase consumer comfort? Now we move into biofurnishings. So another piece that touches on that sustainability, that idea of sort of moving away from that single-use movement we saw in 2020 and more attention being paid to retaining the health of the environment in 2021, biodegradable furnishings. So both setting a new precedent for what it means to integrate your principles into your everyday life, and also the sorts of design that we're seeing in this industry. How is your brand holding itself accountable when it comes to its impact on the environment? All right, now another piece that touches on in the now and what it means to redefine age, but not only through the lens of Gen Z, is unisolated senior. Now, one of the questions I'm often asked during this past year, at least, about the trends that we're seeing is what the world will look like for the boomer generation specifically. This is a generation that, of course, has more of a vested interest in social distancing. So the questions that we get tend to focus on how to prevent loneliness for this generation. Well, the good news is there are many services that are speaking to different ways to connect this generation with their loved ones or pair them with others socially. But what I find very interesting aside from that is the fact that statistically, the generation that has seen the most increase in social media usage from how much they previously used it is the boomer generation. So there's this one part of the puzzle where we're seeing brands step forward to alleviate the potential of boomers feeling more lonely, but there's this other part of it where they themselves are taking the initiative to connect with others online. So the question here, how can your brand authentically support vulnerable populations in challenging times? Okay, so up next we have post-hospitality. Another big question that we've been getting here at Trend Hunter is what will happen to the hospitality industry? Now, interestingly, in 2019, we saw a sort of peak of this industry. In fact, the millennial generation specifically, 64% of them had travel savings for the plans that they were going to make for this year. Although according to Jeremy, you should make the plans anyway and let it be something that is sort of a beacon you can reach toward for the recharting. But regardless of whether or not you are planning a vacation, it will look different by the time we get around to the era where we're able to do so. Now, this idea of what the hospitality industry will turn into very much speaks to that role of tech theme that we saw earlier. Here we see technology that's dedicated toward sanitation, this idea of ensuring that where people are traveling will be safe to do so. It will reduce the amount of face-to-face time with others, and it will be a place that is highly, highly hygienic. How is your brand adjusting to post-pandemic safety? All right, now right on the nose and continuing on with that idea of the role of tech, we have robot retail. Now, as I said, when we were looking at the dark stores insight, there are a lot of different approaches to how to rechart the world for the retail industry, and here is one of them. So of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated the use of robots in retail already, because of course it has its implications in terms of cost savings, its implications in terms of convenience, and of course its implications in terms of safety. And that will simply continue on in the recharting. This is both something that looks at the health of consumers and of course the health of employees in this space. How can your brand go above and beyond to protect customers and employees' health? All right, so we're at 15 out of 20 now for our top 20, and that takes us to non-binary tech. Now, in keeping with that idea of community first and acknowledging the fact that this year has been a sort of political reckoning, as well as a time to think about the pandemic and our personal health, we have this insight that looks at technology brands ranging from video games to smartphones, now including non-binary characters for consumers to use as representation. Now, there has been a sort of reckoning of identity this past year, and a lot of brands have sort of understood now that it's no longer just a concern of a certain set of consumers to be able to truly integrate inclusivity, but it's simply becoming an expectation across the board. And so we're seeing this approached from many different ways. So the question here is quite simple at face value, but very complicated when you get down to the nuts and bolts of it. How can your brand offer better representation? Okay, now in keeping with that theme of the political reckoning of 2020 and this idea of inclusivity, we have Black-owned support. Now, this is an interesting insight because it isn't necessarily about brands showing their support for said causes and for anti-racism, but it's about consumers having this desire to specifically shop by businesses that are owned by people who are from these more sort of marginalized communities. So by and large, these are services that essentially provide a collection of Black-owned businesses for consumers to support. This ties into that note I made earlier with non-binary tech, wherein the idea of wanting to support social causes and principles that people believe in through their shopping habits is no longer niche. It's something that we see a large set of consumers, the majority at this point, interested in. And so there's a need for these ideas of being able to curate services and brands that consumers can shop from that enable them to continue taking these principles into every aspect of their lives. So how can your brand serve underrepresented communities? Now we're into our final 5 of the top 20 trends. Remember, this is a selection of that top 20. The full 100 is available to you. So we're looking here at P2P support. Peer-to-peer support becomes a lifeline for communities overcoming COVID-19. Of course, this ties to that theme of peer-to-peer. So this is not just the support of a specific community, but the support of the local economy as well. Individuals are looking for ways to help each other amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. And that idea of wanting to help each other and act more as neighbors, even if we're not in close physical proximity to one another, will continue on into the recharting. So how is your brand facilitating community support at this time? Next up, we have distance design. Now here we see design and tech enforcing physical distancing practices in public settings, something that we're already seeing rolled out in this year, but that will need to continue, of course, into 2021. It's this idea of creating or redesigning spaces that force mindfulness when people are too close to one another and encouraging safety in a very simple way. So here we see people around the world staying indoors, but of course there will remain instances where people must leave the house and be in common spaces. So what we're seeing with this insight is rethinking the design of those common spaces to be conducive to the safety that is required. How could your brand take measures to promote public health right now and into that recharting? Okay, now we get to remote engagement. Now, remote engagement is interesting because we're essentially doing it right now. So remote engagement is the idea of all the change that is being integrated into the workspace and how to actually try to retain and improve on the experiences that we would have when we were actually in offices working together. Now, the act of doing a webinar virtually, what we're doing right now, is a great example of that. But within this insight, we see examples that are not just about the functionality of being able to communicate with one another virtually in these workspaces, but kind of touching on the bonding that often happens when you're in office spaces together. So we see things like virtual pizza parties. We see things like virtual team building games. These ways to not just ensure that the workplace is still efficient, but still a fun place to be. How might you facilitate your team's remote culture? All right, and now we get to our final of our top 20 insights. And remember, you will get a version of this that is sort of more readable, that you'll be able to flip through by yourself and with your teams. And it is environmental community. So environmental community is all about sustainable community concepts to focus on social and ecological advancements. Now, I think that this is an excellent final of our top 20 because it's so future facing and it's so optimistic. The idea is that the entire function of a city, its architecture, the system it uses to sort of keep people moving and keep people successful and efficient, are going to take into account social and ecological advancements and needs that have arisen during times of crisis and chaos. So what we'll see are lifestyle changes that are both large and small being more top of mind. Examples include clean energy community concepts or multi-generational subscription housing. So you can see that there are questions of, affordability here. There are questions of housing for various populations. There are questions of environmental sustainability. And finally, these are issues that are being planned for more thoroughly into the recharting. So how could your brand approach sustainability in a sort of all-encompassing way? All right, so that caps us off for our top 20 trends and takes us into our virtual safari portion. Now, for our virtual safari portion, basically we'll get our CEO, Jeremy Gucce, Chief Trend Hunter, back in here, and he and I will have a little chat about all of the trends that we showed, as well as any additional sort of thoughts that Jeremy may have. So you can see him on your screen, but you can also see him in his little window there. Here's Jeremy, all of his credentials. Jeremy, do you want to say anything else about your biography here, who you are, what you do?
No, we're good to go. I don't know if you need the screen anymore, if we can go full screen so people can see our faces. But Armida and I are just going to sort of take a look at any questions that you have. So put any thoughts in that you have about 2021 or the different trends that we've seen. And we're happy to give you our reactions. Again, Armida's team is overseeing the insights that have gone to more than 2,000 custom trend reports just during COVID. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about probably what you're thinking about in a wide variety of industries. And we're sort of privy to where people are going. I can't tell you what different brands are doing, but we know very specifically what some of the brands we're working with are doing during this time. And the cool part is that some are doing well and acting almost complacent. Others are furiously hungry for how to reinvent and sort of like actively launching and creating new products. And then the third category is sort of cash strapped on the sidelines. So I think 2021 is going to be very interesting in terms of how brands rechart. And I really do think that who's in the lead will change. And I think that the deck will be reshuffled. So that's kind of my main primer. And yeah, Army, I loved watching, listening to the thought on these 20 examples of how the world changes.
Thank you. Yeah. So I guess a question to kind of kick us off here. What are your most exciting predictions for the recharting?
So I'm heartbroken when I go down this street that I'm in Toronto, and those of you who went to Future Festival may have seen my little primer, but I did an experiment with my COVID puppy, Forrest, and I walked on a 0.6 mile, 1 kilometer walk that's like 10 or 15 minutes in an area that'd be the hustling and bustling area in my part of the city, Toronto Bloor West, full of little shops. But actually there were 31 shops that were already boarded up for lease. And they are, you've got this in your city. The local blog here that covers the local restaurants just published a list of 140 like beloved places that are gone. Now, let's put a positive spin on this. What I think is interesting is that once we emerge, all those are vacant spaces which open up for the next generation of entrepreneurial ideas and thinking. So I think that a lot of us are bogged down, but I also think that there's an entire young, new, youthful generation that can suddenly take advantage of low rents, easy entry costs, lack of competition because everyone's gone, and maybe even subsidies to get started. And that means when I look at our mega trends that Armida's team puts together, trendhunter.com/pro, I think that they're going to accelerate. And I think you're going to see business models that we're kind of covering on Trend Hunter just launch and emerge and fill the spaces. And that's probably 3 to 6 months after things can really open up that you start actually seeing this begin. But those storefronts will get filled.
So that ties to a question that I see here from Therese, which is, do you think retail will now fail or boom in different ways? And what do you see? So you've kind of already touched on that idea of these more exciting sort of younger brands stepping in, these startups and taking those spaces. Anything else to add to that about retail and how that'll continue to transform?
Well, for a long time, we've been covering how the shift of retail becoming experiential. And there was this really interesting chart. It's in some of our Trend Hunter presentations from 2 years ago. But the way it looks is that if you went to a retail location in the 90s, it was a big beige box store that was boring. And then in 1999, there was this mad gold rush to get into e-commerce. And the brands that were retailers put all their money into trying to figure out online, and they delayed investment in the store. And then the dot-com bubble burst. Those brands as dot-com things didn't work out. And then we went into a little financial meltdown, and the stores still got ignored. Then just as things started coming back, 2006, 7, 8, the stores started thinking about investing again into their stores, and then the market collapsed financially, particularly in the US. So the retail location got ignored for another 5 years. So suddenly it's like 2012, 2013, and social media takes off and everybody starts investing in social media. So the brand teams, the innovation teams we work with have literally been distracted so long. And then finally they start getting into social media and making the stores experiential. And in the last 4 years, let's say, you've seen stores and retail and malls become more experiential, more exciting, the pop-up shops, the stuff. And now we're hit with this, and there's a lot of retailers going bankrupt. So what I think is going to happen is that those big brand retail stores have still been ignoring their customer experience for a very long time. It's like they were just plunging back in, and now the only way to survive is to absolutely to have that experiential component. And there's been about 500 decent recognizable international bankruptcies of well-known retailers, from Neiman Marcus to Hertz during COVID. And so I think that what will happen is that's going to be a real shell shock to those that are left over. So the same trends that we keep pushing right now on experience and multi-sensation are going to actually become critically important if you want to be one that survives. Now, the upside that I'll leave you with, the upside is that the online e-commerce purchases from Amazon are creating immense guilt right now, because you and I have a house, whether Amazon's your choice or someone else, we have a house full of boxes in all likelihood that need to be taken out, and then a street beside us with mom and pop shops that are gone. So what that also does is it means once we emerge, there's a guilt to make up for, a divergent pattern, pattern thinking, and that means I will try not to buy from Amazon. And actually in Toronto, we just saw something come across yesterday called Not Amazon, which was a listing of all the local businesses to support, whether it's books or gifts that are not Amazon. And that was sort of going viral within our city. So this feeling is going to happen. And so on one side, there will be an urgency to become critically more experiential. And on the other hand, you will have a little momentum in your favor with an anti-e-commerce feeling of supporting local.
Nice. Great. Okay, cool. So we have a couple of questions, actually, both in the Q&A and in the chat here, that are about remote engagement and work culture. So specifically, Pam's articulation of this that I thought you would like, Jeremy, is what are the mega trends that will continue into 2021 that are impacting the sort of remote engagement and corporate culture in, the virtual space?
So the mega trends are pretty interesting when we start thinking about the sort of virtual space. But I think that there's still like a human thing. So I just pulled up our mega trend wheel. Those of you that want to kind of look at some of the mega trends, by the way, here it is. It takes a second to animate in, and you can see our mega trends and click and deep dive. But if you take a look at the mega trends that are out there, and we go category by category, it's quite interesting to think about what happens. And this won't perfectly answer your question in terms of like just remote experience. But if I look at these in terms of cyclicality, nostalgia, let's go there. Yeah, I need to think about what brings back my childhood memories right now. I need need to bring back the return to the kitchen and that sacred family meal. Naturality, I am so upset about all the cardboard boxes in my house. So A, I need to try and be more eco and support brands that are. And B, COVID has made us feel like small people that are victims to a giant planet, no longer in control of the planet. And there's like cartoons that showcase COVID as the first wave, and the second wave is net global warming. So I think that these mega trends, those are just a couple examples, but they become pretty huge. And just rolling through some of them, the next category there is experience. Well, yeah, experience is on pause right now. So similar to what we saw in the 2008 recession, if you pause experience and people can't do what they want, once they emerge, they rethink about how important experience is. And we start seeing supercharged tourism. It accelerates even further. I'm going to have like the wildest adventure I possibly can once I can get through this, because I need to make up for a year or two or whatever it's going to be of lost travel. Rolling around the corner, let's see, divergence, many to many speaks to the fact that a traditional world was one to many or couple to many, whether it's media or retail. And many to many is the idea of supporting the small retailers, the individual, the Etsy. And so then when I think about that, it's also interesting because then I really want to support local and the little guy, and the little guy is the most battered. Convergence. Okay, this one's very, very cool. Hybridization is the idea that the lines that blur one industry to another, they disappear. So for example, Amazon, nobody thought Amazon was going to become a grocer. And then they bought Whole Foods, and within half an hour, there was the big grocery stores lost $30 billion of market value in half an hour. And now, oh, I guess Amazon could be a grocer. Well, here's the COVID version of that. Right now, your competitor or people you don't think are competitors are sitting there hustling, spending a year on their R&D, maybe their acquisitions, because they're deciding to get into new markets. And if you're someone that feels like your market is doing okay and it's cushy, there's somebody coming for you because they need to get into a market that's profitable, and people are changing their definition of what they compete in. So that's kind of wild. Then reduction, simplicity. Yeah, in a chaotic world, mental health is a huge issue and everything's overloaded. I want the simplest, easiest product and service to cut through all of the noise. And finally, acceleration. When we talk about things like AI, this is the biggest advancement year for AI that there's ever been, but you don't see it because we're distracted by politics and COVID. So this doesn't answer perfectly the question on the virtual workforce, but it was about tying it to megatrends. And what I just want to say is that the megatrends don't change in this short of a time frame. They accelerate or they change pace, or if they're pent up like experience, they become extra pent up. So you can use this reference, both the patterns and the mega trends. You can click through and you can learn them and you can learn how the patterns work. And this can help you think about what it means for your workforce, but very much, and this hasn't changed for us in the last 2 or 3 years. We've been hanging on to the same ones because they seem still relevant from our data. But you can see how this is a lens to help you think about how your culture, your workforce, and your clients kind of change in the next little bit. I hope that's helpful, even though it's a little bit indirect as an answer to your question. And for others, I hope that kind of answers a broader question that might relate some of this to you.
Great, yeah. So to kind of bridge that gap between the megatrends and specifically the megatrend of artificial intelligence, and a question we got here from Robert, technology is a facilitator, but we're entering a new era of social design with community and human over form and function. Yes, that is absolutely true. But one thing about the artificial intelligence megatrend is it kind of acknowledges the fact that really technology is best used when it's used to increase human capacity, period. Things that people already want to do and are already trying to do made easier through the use of technology. So when we think about technology, especially in the recharting, I would encourage us all to not necessarily think about technology just as something that increases convenience, but also as something that can enable this sort of community and human approach to everything that we're doing. That's kind of already what we're using it as over this past year, right? You know, we've seen the increase in the usage of services like House Party, which is a group video app, We're seeing increases in the use of TikTok, which of course is a place where people can just go and be silly. These places are incredibly human. They're incredibly community focused, but they're also technology. So in the recharting, don't think of technology as just one thing serving one purpose of convenience or function. It's going to enable, it's enabling human connection right now, right? So to that note, Jeremy, I'd like your thoughts on this. I have a couple myself. We had a question in the question section here. Sorry, everyone, I'm flipping between the chat and the Q&A. That is about what happens to children and the idea of how they'll continue to connect and grow and play actually in the recharting. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's a couple thoughts. So first of all, when I look at my niece and nephew, just to make it real, Alex and Allie, 10 and 11, they don't know much better. Like they're young. It seems weird, but like it blurs together. This is kind of what kids seem is real. And yet that will shape them. And this will impact how they outlook to the world. Right now, many schools went back to the school and then back to virtual. And if they were in the school, there were like colored zones and numbered zones, and you couldn't cross over different barriers. So there's been a pretty real impact on kids. And I think that when I look at naturality as a megatrend, and I think about like eco, I think about how kids now would look at this and see this as a human-made disaster. Or I've seen a quote, wave 1 of COVID was a natural disaster. Wave 2 of COVID is a man-made disaster. And if I was a kid looking at this and I could see everything out there, I think, why didn't they do this? Why didn't they close down? Why didn't people just lock up for a little bit? And then you relate that to the environment, and it makes it very easy to see how adults are screwing over the planet at the same time. So I think that if you're a kid, what will be a takeaway from all of this is that humankind is not in control of the planet. It is vice versa. The planet is in control of us, whether it's disease or eco. And so I think that there's an interesting implication here where it's like the Greta generation. We've used this in a couple other presentations. The Greta generation will furiously look at how some of the world was handled by us. And that's not what happened when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I don't question how my parents are doing it. I'm still learning. I'm the 10, 12-year-old student. I'm learning. I don't have an opinion that adults messed up. And I don't think that's the case anymore. I think this creates a different perception of the world if you've experienced it. Now, Armida, I want to turn that back to you though, because for those of you who haven't watched, every year Armida's presentation at Future Festival on the generations and then the micro generations is one of our absolute highest rated. And she talks about how individual generations get impacted by the trauma, the crisis, the major significant event, the launch of whatever, and how that shapes humanity. So what happens if I'm, Armida, a youngest generation or even like a nouveau millennial? What happens when I watch this and experience it?
Yeah, so I'm sure those of you who have been sort of keeping up with the generational sort of study that we're seeing come out of this past year have heard the term Generation C, which is the idea that the youngest members of Gen Z, so those who are younger than their teen years, the children really, are essentially not going to remember what society was like before the pandemic hit anyway. And now it's interesting because we've seen this before. If you are a nouveau millennial, so you're a younger member of the millennial generation, then you were raised in an era where you didn't remember what the world was like pre 9/11. So another, cataclysmic event that kind of changed the way the world had to move. And what we end up seeing in those instances are generations that end up kind of just growing their way around it and becoming accustomed to this idea that, for example, playtime is something that you do strictly virtually, or, the schoolyard is a place where you don't just keep distance because it's polite, but because it's safer that way. Now, whether or not that's a good or bad thing is up for debate, because I think one thing that we as adults need to remember is part of the reason why this all feels so strange is because we've become accustomed to the path dependency. A generation for whom this is path dependency, for whom this is normal, may not necessarily feel a sense of anxiety or fear around these things. It's just their normal. Now, one of the concerns I think for the adults in the room and for the parents here is what that means for building a sense of community for children. Because of course, although there are these options to be able to learn virtually, school isn't just about learning, it's about socializing with other children. And so that's where the onus kind of falls on the social media brands to integrate more of this sort of intimate socialization approach. I predict that there will be fewer social media sites that are about showcasing the highlights of a person's life and more social media sites that are about closer sort of groupings where people can actually have a tight knit circle and foster that the way you would if you were able to go see a movie together in person. Yeah, so let's see. Do we have, oh, we're right at 2:01. We have time for any more questions here. So one question that we had was about the function of the megatrends. So yes, the megatrends did obviously become a key piece of the sort of fireside chat and audience Q&A here. To clarify, if you haven't seen in the chat, the interactive megatrends wheel has been dropped in there. So that's trendhunter.com/pro. When you're looking at these, one thing to note is that the megatrends themselves are indeed identifying consumer motivations. So these are sort of evergreen consumer motivations and how exactly they manifest. So for example, prosumerism is a megatrend that is a result of every person's desire to continue gaining new skills and to continue doing new things and feeling like an expert and constantly sort of learning. Tribalism, for example, is a megatrend that's born out of the very human need, which especially this year has shown us, to connect with one another and feel like we belong to a group. Whereas the patterns of opportunity, which are that outer circle, show how to actually take action on these megatrends. So just sort of clarification on that tool there. And I think that's pretty much all that we have time for. Jeremy, any closing thoughts? Anything else to say here? You're on mute.
First time on a Zoom conference. Thank you, all of you, for joining with us with your presence and your lunch hour with us. And the only note that I would just sort of end on is noting that now is the time to dream big, because chaos creates enormous opportunity. It's intimidating, but actually these are the time periods when the world's most iconic organizations and creative ideas have been formed. So dream big. Now is the time to come up with your brilliant, wonderful ideas.
Excellently put. Thank you, everyone.
Cheers.